So a funny thing happened on the way to GDC. Our game got delayed. We were originally going to be out in around February. So I'm working on Skulls of the Shogun by Hona Temple Studios. And it's kind of, we call it an arcade strategy game. The AI is in fact basically done with, minus some bugs. However, the delay is mostly to add another platform and add some new multiplayer components. So I figured I'd structure this talk instead of just like what went right, what went wrong, more in terms of like how I iterated on the AI, because it's kind of a cross-genre game. As you'll see, there's some interesting elements. I didn't really know what I was doing when I set out to build the AI. And my background, I've not really worked on strategy games, worked on character action games at like Radical and EA and SOE, and then I left EA to go indie and work with Hona Temple on this. So roughly, it's a little bit like Advance Wars, where you have squads of units and players take turns. You're a little ghost samurai, but there's no grid. It's not about picking the perfect square. It's much more about like the tactics of the environment. Like, which way do you flank your opponent? Can you fake in one direction and double back around? It's more about how you use the space and less about like rock, paper, scissors type strategy. So there's just some interesting constraints. There's RTS elements with the analog sort of space. There's turn-based elements, board gamey sort of elements with the way the turns are structured. Actions in the game actually are a resource because you only have 5 actions per turn. And so the AI needs to treat them essentially as the most valuable resource. And the overall direction for the game was that, like I said, it was an arcade strategy game. The game had to be fast. The pace of the turns was fast. And so the AI couldn't be sitting there. The player couldn't be sitting there waiting for the AI. I'll run through briefly just some of the game mechanics so you have an idea of what the AI had to deal with. There's 3 core unit types: cavalry, archers, infantry. They kind of behave like you'd expect. Archers have a long attack range, cavalry have a long movement range. The general, however, on the left, he's kind of like the king and queen in chess combined. He's the most powerful unit. He has 2 attacks per turn, but if he dies, you lose, so you have to defend him at all costs. There's quite a variety of resources in the game throughout the battlefield. The most important are skulls, the skulls of your enemies. When they die, you can eat them. That's how you power up your units. And if you eat 3 skulls, you turn into a demon, and a demon has an extra attack per turn, which again is like with only 5 attacks essentially, it's a big advantage. There are potions that can like up your attack strength or heal you. There's buildings which essentially you can haunt and capture, and then they'll be owned by your team. Rice paddies will give you rice a little bit each turn. Rice is essentially your currency that you can use to summon new troops at the summon shrines. There's other shrines in the environment that will give you a free unit, some sort of one type of magic user. However, if the enemy haunts that building back, you'll lose your unit and they'll get one instead, so you have to defend it. There's also cleansing shrines, which kind of do damage to all your enemies in that area if you control it. There's different types of terrain. On the right, there's bamboo. Any unit in bamboo has a chance of being missed. There's ledges. The game has like a really sort of physics engine where units can knock others back with melee attacks, and if you knock someone off a ledge, that's an instant kill. You can knock them into thorns. That'll do damage. You can use ice to increase the amount. You'll knock a unit back as well on some levels. And those units you'll find in the environment, the magic users, there's a fox monk who's kind of like a healer. There's a salamander monk who's all about fire and lightning. There's a crow monk who's a trickster who can use wind to knock guys around or steal the other player's rice and stuff like that. So these units all gain spells with each skull that they eat. And so the AI has to be able to not just deal with those spells, but use them and trigger them appropriately. So the first pass through the AI, it basically seemed like, okay, here's an N by M problem. You have all your units and all your targets, and really to make the best decision, you'd want to compare like all possible pairings. So that seems infeasible at first, like performance-wise, but that would be ideal. So took a big list of like unit target pairs and evaluated each one using kind of a utility theory-based approach where each pairing is given like a floating point score, and then that's sorted, and you pick the most important ones. So the issues that were apparent kind of immediately was that it was really hard to compare strategic differences with so many pairs. Like, there's different types of objectives, attack and defense, and like how do you really evaluate them equally? There's also a huge difference in utility between available objectives and unavailable objectives. And by that I mean something you could perform this turn was an available objective. And if the AI instead decided to pursue an unavailable objective while there was an available objective that turn, that essentially kind of made that action look sort of pointless and really dumb looking. And so also deciding when to defend required a lot more context. So, in terms of what unit was good to defend and when, you didn't want to embed that logic into every single comparison. So there had to be some sort of higher level. And then pathfinding-wise, I started with a grid. I could have used a navigation mesh to deal with the analog space. It might have had less error. But ultimately, there were dynamic obstacles because units could form walls together. So even most navigation mesh approaches dealing with dynamic obstacles typically do stuff like grid the additional triangles to deal with it. So there was no way to just completely avoid that error. Like a unit's movement radius and attack radius will never align perfectly with whatever grid node or whatever space representation I used. So I knew I had the architecture fundamentally had to deal with that. So the main lessons through that first iteration was just that I really needed to organize the objective comparisons. The architecture had to deal with error and be fault tolerant, and that also target distance was essentially the one place where it could not avoid that n by m performance problem. You really need to know all those unit to target distances so you could pick the best ones straight off. So on the second pass to the AI, basically I hooked up a quad tree which gave an estimate as to what the distance was between a unit and its potential target. And this was much fewer nodes, 400 nodes on average, instead of 20,000 nodes. So, however, it's more inaccurate, and the architecture, again, had to deal with that. So, you'd have that estimate, you'd make some strategic decisions, but you have to start that path, get a real path when you started acting. So we took the objective list, and instead of making it pairs, just a list of single targets, split it by type, whether it was a resource or an enemy or something, your own unit you wanted to defend. And then break up and do a little bit of analysis as to what the high-level strategy modes were, such that in a way that matched the average battle. You build up resources, you attack, and then potentially, if you're losing, you'll do something more desperate. So the overall algorithm was basically run the pathfinding on a quad tree to get all the distance estimates, rank the objectives in each category, find which units could perform those objectives this turn based on the pathfinding estimates, run the high-level sort of strategy analysis, and this was just a couple pages of code tops, just a few if statements a piece, basically. And then take those 5 orders and assign them to the top objectives defined by the strategy type. So if you're doing the resource gathering strategy, you might want to assign 3, resource objectives, 2 attack objectives, and 1 defense objective. And if you didn't have enough resource objectives, you would fall back and okay, I'll find some available attack objectives. And then if you didn't have any enough available objectives, you would fall back and pick some unavailable ones. So this made comparing objectives way easier to deal with. We lost some comparisons. So when one unit X is better than unit Y for 2 different objectives, but he's a better fit for the lower priority objective, he'll get picked for the first one just because it's the higher priority objective. So you lose that ability to kind of capture that nuance without, you can go in and occasionally sort of tweak the objective scoring to kind of avoid issues with that. But generally speaking, that's okay because you're still picking the highest priority objective. If the AI is still making a good decision, it may not be making the best decision, but it's still making a good decision. It doesn't look dumb, so that's good. And then the quad tree, the error, like I said, you reevaluate. Potentially, the unit could actually start acting and following its path, and collision could prevent it from reaching it, and that needs to go back up and potentially reevaluate all what its current objective is, pick another one. So occasionally, it actually changes what it's doing, which is okay as long as it doesn't happen too much. It kind of looks human, and he still, again, does something good. He still picks a target and does something, so it works out pretty well. On the third pass through, it became apparent there were a few situations where you still did need to prioritize unavailable objectives when you needed to reinforce units. If you had 3 or 4 units in battle and a ton more out of battle, if you just had those 3 or 4 units attack, they would get whittled down. But you really needed to bring up a bunch of units from behind to the front. And so that was just another strategic mode of analysis. 3 or 4 lines of code in that, a couple pages of code, pretty straightforward. And then the objective comparisons needed more data. Like when all other concerns are equal, like what makes one unit better than another? So it needed a bit more, and I knew the way to solve that was through influence maps. I'll get to that in a minute. And then stuff like difficulty modes and advanced spell use. So there's a lot of papers and talks about dealing with influence maps, ways of propagating the data, manipulating the data, but I had a problem finding like really good ways of how to have that data influence decision making, or how do you really use it. And so here's like the influence of the red army on the map. Here's the influence on the blue army of the map, propagated sort of exponentially. The key, however, was really understanding what the abstract representation of the data was, and then you could do these operations of subtraction, addition, multiplication, whatever, but only really by understanding what the underlying data meant. So this map is the resource appeal, essentially. It's the strength of the individual resource type, how important it is overall, minus the enemy influence, so you get the ones that are less protected. Then you can do stuff like the threat level. So this is essentially the red team's influence minus the blue team's influence. So the blue team can look at this and go, well, those are the areas I'm going to be unprotected. And you can additionally do stuff like take the activity, which is the red team plus the blue team influence, and take that intersection, and then you would get essentially the front line, the vulnerability. We didn't end up using that too much, and pretty much just relied on the threat, though. So this was easily plugged in to the objective evaluation, since there's already a spot in the architecture for that. It influenced, is the base objective score. Each objective had a few cases that it might multiply that up or down, but fairly easy to manage. Then additionally, there was stuff like ledges, where you wanted units to position to attack enemies, to knock them off ledges better, avoid ledges, form walls, which would protect them from being knocked off. And this was just done through influence maps again, with a chance of how likely you were to be damaged by terrain, and then you could define like which direction to knock off an enemy in the most likely chance he would be hurt by terrain. Then advanced spells, we just use some simple conservative scoring here because a lot of them cost rice, so you didn't want the AI just going crazy, like spending money. And then for difficulty modeling, we basically did a lot of play testing, just watching players, categorizing behaviors as novice behaviors or expert behaviors, and then assigning them, based on your difficulty mode to happen. The expert behaviors happen less often on the novice difficulty setting. They do still occasionally happen, just so players will potentially learn and see, oh yeah, I can knock guys off ledges. That's right. There's a few things the AI doesn't do and won't. There's one spell in particular. It's kind of summons a barbarian, which takes a lot of context of understanding, like, since it can attack your units as well as the enemy units, when do you use it to maximize its impact? So take a lot of work, a lot of analysis. And it doesn't really do master level strategies. So I can only pull this off like against less experienced players. I've been playing this game for like 3 years almost. So if you can position your units just out of range of the enemy units, so he will have to advance towards you and still not be able to attack you, you will have the advantage because on your next turn you'll be able to attack him first. And so it's very, it only happens on like large maps and only if you're really kind of aware of it and are very zen, I guess. But so players only really do it, once they play through the whole campaign. It takes a lot of play to really get to that point. And like I said, it only happens on larger levels. So, and that would require predicting the player's next few turns, dealing with, creating a map of the likely positions they'd be in, a couple orders of magnitude more work. So, nope. So general just takeaways here, my version of always be closing from Glengarry, Glenn Ross, always be architecting, never spend too much time up front on a game that, the type of game you've not worked on. You're going to be wrong as to what the architecture should be. Leave, apply prototyping methodology. Be willing to throw stuff out. Leave spaces, though, so you can plug stuff in without having to throw stuff out. That always helps. And then compare apples to apples. Take split up decision making to compare similar utilities, and take common analysis and push them up to higher levels so you can take advantage of sort of broader strategic applications of that analysis. And then just deal with fault tolerance at every level. If an error happens at one level, push it back up to the level above, let it try to deal with it. If not, keep pushing it up until at the highest level, you might have to reevaluate completely what you're doing. But this is just like something that most flaws in game AI typically stem from the architecture not dealing with this, not adjusting control flow and dealing with errors. So super important. Yeah, so Skulls of Shogun coming out in the fall, and here's my email for more info.
Hi, my name is Daniel Brewer. I'm the lead AI programmer at Digital Extremes, and I'm here to talk to you today about some of the enhancements and improvements we made to our AI for the Darkness 2, just to add a little bit more life and realism to our agents. The Darkness 2 is a narrative-driven first-person action shooter with superpowers, and that's quite a mouthful. We were new developers on the franchise, and we knew there was a lot of expectations that we had to live up to, and we feel due to the response that we did all right. Some of the topics I'm going to talk about today are the perception system that we used, the reaction system and the combat chatter, a little bit of agent coordination, and then the collision avoidance. Most of what I'm going to talk about is just the big high-level concepts, nothing too nitty-gritty details. But we feel that a lot of this made a difference to our AI. So firstly, the perception system. From our previous game, Dark Sector, we already had pretty good perceptions. We had view cone, raycast line of sight checks. We had sound pathing and fall off for audible checks, proximity checks, last known position, tracking of the target, all that good stuff. But we wanted to add a few more kind of stealth elements, stealth sections to the game. Just nothing as serious as a dedicated sneaking game, but enough that you could sneak up on unsuspecting enemies or kind of hide in the shadows and sneak past them. And there were a couple of things that we had to do in order to get this right. The first was just quite simply to give our agents multiple view cones. When they were idle or patrolling, they had a narrow view cone that was quite short, which made it easier for you to sneak around the side of them. Once you were in combat and they were alert, we'd widen that view cone up so they could see a lot more of the environment and they would be able to track you in combat a lot more. The second was light and darkness. The illumination, the light and the shadows play a very big role in our gameplay in Darkness 2, and we needed to feed that into our perception system. So before we actually check a visual perception if we can see a target, we measure the illumination at the target's position in the level, and we use that to scale the maximum view distance that the target can see. And this is quite a simple way to get our agents to be able to see a lot further into well-lit areas, but if you're hiding in the shadows, they need to get much closer to you to be able to see you. Secondly, we wanted to build in a bit of a reaction time. We wanted our agents to respond in a much more natural manner to these kind of stealth gameplay. We didn't want an instantaneous going from idle to full Rambo just because you stuck your head around a corner to see what was around there and one visible raycast hit you. So instead, our agents build up a knowledge representation of their targets that they know about. They remember things like, can they see the target right now? Can they hear him? Is he actually making noise right now? Have their teammates told them about him? All this stuff feeds in to an importance score that we give to each target. And the more perceptions we receive about a target, the more this importance score ramps up over time. When we stop receiving perceptions, the importance decays down. Instead of triggering our behaviors and reactions as we receive perceptions, we trigger them when our importance score crosses certain boundaries. So we have in the top corner there, the Brotherhood is on patrol and he spots the Darkling. That importance starts ramping up. It's just a glance that he has it right now. Once it crosses the investigate boundary, he thinks there's something there, so he'll stop, he'll turn, face the direction, start to investigate what's going on over there, try and search the area to see if someone's hiding there. And only then, once we our importance raises up above the combat threshold, do we actually engage in combat, call backup for our teammates, and so on. This provides a much more natural kind of escalation to the stealth gameplay, which we think worked quite well. So barks are simple, quick, one-line context dialogue that we throw out there for the AI can say. Barks are very important because they let your player know that your AI has made a decision and that your AI is about to do something, hopefully something interesting. We wanted to get away from just simple status barks that everyone's using, the I'm reloading or I'm throwing a grenade. They're important to have, but in our game, The Darkness, there is so much going on during the gameplay. The player is slicing guys in half with the demon arm, the Darkling's jumping on guys and pulling them out of cover. There's all this chaos that's going on around them. And we wanted our AI, our agents, to actually respond to those events that were going on and comment about them and chat about them and call out, hey, there's stuff happening over there. We felt that that would make them seem much more connected to this virtual world. To do this, we used our reaction controller. So when an event occurs, it gets passed to the perception system to check if the agent can actually see or hear the event that's going on. And then it gets passed to the reaction controller. This is a component of our agent that sits there and receives these perceived events and interprets them and kind of filters out and maps them up to an appropriate reaction depending on what our awareness state is. We can do some simple reactions such as just playing a sound bark or changing an awareness state. We deal with that right there in our reaction controller, so we don't need to interrupt any of our currently running behaviors at all. If we want a more complicated reaction, something like turning to face at a target or playing an animation, we would instead post a message to our agent's blackboard, and the behavior tree would pick that up and respond as appropriate or if appropriate. We ended up having 2 reaction handling behaviors in our behavior tree. One was low level that dealt with when they were idling or patrolling around, the kind of more ambient reactions. And then we had another one, a high priority one, which would interrupt them during combat, say if the Darkling was just making a distraction. So now that we have our agents perceiving events happening in the world and reacting to them, it'll often happen that multiple agents will see the same event at the same time and they'll both want to say the same thing, which is not quite what you want. Typically, you just let the first guy through and the second guy is tough luck, we just stop him so we don't overcrowd our audio space. But we wanted to have our agents talking back and forward to each other in combat. We felt if they're in the midst of combat and they're yelling back and forward, chatting to each other, it would make them, again, feel a little bit more real. So we have this call and response system. When an agent plays a sound bark, instead of just blocking everyone else, we open up a reply window. If another agent wants to say the same thing, like Agent 2 there, and he wants to say that during that reply window, we check this call-response map to check if we have a valid reply, valid response to the initial line that the first agent said. And if we do find one, we will we'll queue up this response to happen when the first line of dialogue has finished playing. And that was a pretty easy way to get the agents to actually kind of seem like they're talking back and forward to each other in the middle of combat without having to do a whole lot of complicated messaging. We ended up recording about 3,000 lines of combat chatter in the game. That's just purely combat chatter from the enemies. And that was split up amongst 3 different voices for the mobsters and 4 for the Brotherhood enemies. And we would make sure that the only agents with a different voice would respond because we didn't want to have it sound like one guy was talking to himself. That would be a little weird. Agents always look smarter when they're cooperating and working together. And when the designers wanted a riot shield-equipped enemy in the game, we knew we had a good opportunity for some teamwork. So we created the buddy system. The buddy system is essential for the survival of our agents because it gives the player someone else to shoot at. The system works a lot like classifieds ads. It's kind of like Kijiji for AI. The Brotherhood with a shield will post an ad to the team Blackboard saying, hey, I've got a shield, I'm looking for some help. try and, who wants to help me out? The other enemies will then, if they know how to perform that same tactic, will respond to the ad. And once we get one response in, we open up a short kind of voting window where we allow multiple responses in, and we keep the best scoring response. Once that closes, we mark the advert as closed. That stops any further agents actually responding to the ad that we don't want them involved in. And now that we have our closed buddy team, we can actually signal to each other straight through that memory location on the team blackboard. And that allows us to have one agent firing while the other one is reloading, and vice versa. When they want to move, we can get them to move together in a coordinated fashion. So they're advancing behind the shield, which is quite menacing. The whole system kind of just takes place in our behavior tree, and if they have the tactic to work together and there's people available, it'll just open up this new option for them. And if not, they will just continue with their normal combat behaviors. So finally, the collision avoidance. After doing some investigation into some academic research on the topic, we came across ORCA, that's Optimal Reciprocal Collision Avoidance, by Jur van den Berg and his colleagues at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The URL is over there. I highly recommend you go directly to the website to get the research papers and the videos. It's very, very interesting stuff. I'm just going to give a brief overview of how the algorithm works. It's just a very brief intro. And then I'll cover some of the issues we faced with it and how we dealt with them in our game. ORCA works in velocity space. Now what that means is that instead of just reasoning about the positions of obstacles that are in the world around us, we plot their trajectories, their velocities. This allows us to reason about how something is moving and where it will be in kind of the near future, which is a lot more similar to how we as humans think about avoidance. You're not really worried about a stationary car that's a couple meters away from you. You're worried about the car that's 30 meters down the street but coming into you at 30 miles an hour. The other thing that ORCA uses is a linear programming to solve for the optimal velocity. And since we already had a linear programming solving code in our engine, we felt this was a very good fit for us to try. So ORCA works by calculating velocity obstacles. This is a bit of a complicated term, but it refers to a region of velocity space which is defined by the collection of velocities where a collision is guaranteed to occur in a short period of time. So if we have these two agents moving towards each other, the blue agent moving towards the red, the velocity obstacle kind of looks like this rounded off cone. It's derived from the shapes and relative velocities of the agents as they're moving. Now all we have to do to avoid the red agent is pick a velocity that's outside of that region, which seems quite simple, but we have an infinite amount of choice now. We can speed up, we can slow down, steer around him. There's too many options. And that's where the linear programming comes in. We need a linear constraint, so we take a tangent to our velocity obstacle and use that as a restriction to our linear program, and we can then solve for optimal velocity. This is all very good and well. If you have multiple guys that you need to avoid, everything just stacks on top of one another. You've got 3 velocity obstacles. I think you can just see them there. And each one adds its own constraint, which whittles down at our possible solution space. But we did have a couple of issues that we ran into. The first is the algorithm, the reciprocal part of the algorithm means that both agents will take responsibility for moving out of each other's way. So if 2 agents are walking towards each other, they'll both sidestep a little bit to get past. If one agent is standing still, he will back up a little bit to allow the moving agent through. But when you've got an agent that's standing in cover, you don't want him to move at all. It would look a little bit dumb if he stepped out of cover to let some guy past. It just doesn't make sense. So firstly, in those situations, we just made the moving agent take full responsibility for the avoidance, and that works most of the time. But every now and then, you calculate a tangent, and it limits you to the velocities that are going to steer you straight into the ball, and that looks even worse. So what we did is we partitioned up our nav mesh around our cover locations, and when an agent was taking cover there, we would disable that region of the nav mesh space, and A-star comes to the rescue yet again and helps steer the agent around the stationary guys. The other issue we came across was path following. When your agent is moving through the world, they're following a directed path, and you pretty much know that if you're staying on that path, there's no possible way that you're going to collide with someone. Your path is going to steer you away before you get anywhere close to them. But Orca is pretty oblivious to this fact, so all it does is just say, hey, if I'm moving at this speed in this direction, I'm going to collide with that guy in 2 seconds' time, so I should avoid him. And that can lead you to do all sorts of weird things like steer to the right of him instead of when you want to follow your path to the left. So all we do there is we project our current path point into velocity space as well and compare that against the velocity obstacles. And if we can reach our path point without touching the velocity obstacle, then we know that we don't even need to consider those agents to avoid. We only need to avoid the agents whose velocity obstacles lie along our path. And that helps quite a bit. So I'm just going to start up a quick video that just shows off some of the topics that I've been talking about today.
I'm losing my mind. Shoot all the lights out. I hate this. Hey, Jackie. No. Looks like you lost some weight. Ain't your fault. Cover me. That's the kind of you piece of shit. Get it off me. Get it out in the open now. Who put out the lights? Just shoot. Light up the place. I'm gonna take you apart, you pussy. It's a bird. Oh my God! He's gone! Lay down some fire!
And that, you can see there just a whole lot of the things I talked about, the combat chatter back and forth, all that good, reacting to events that are taking place in the environment. I know it's been pretty quick, and I've just covered a lot of topics very briefly, but I hope that you can get just a couple of ideas that you can steal for your own games. Oh, questions at the end. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Michael Daw. I am a software engineer at Big Huge Games, and I was an AI programmer for Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning. If you haven't played the game yet, let's just discuss real quick what it is so that you know what we're talking about today. First and foremost, Reckoning is an action RPG. We emphasize more than anything else in the game the moment-to-moment experience of the combat. It's also very, very big. It's open world. You can pretty much go anywhere you want at any time. Just to give you an idea of what kind of numbers we're talking about, there are about 600 spaces. There's about 24,000 different types of objects in the world. There are about 500 quests on the disc when it ships. And what is this picture doing here? The last console game that Big Huge Games did was in 2007. It was an Xbox Live arcade game called Catan. It was Settlers of Catan for Xbox Live Arcade. So Reckoning was our first RPG on a console that we had ever built. And that's going to come into play a little bit later. What weren't we trying to do? Because AI is influenced by your design decisions. So the first thing that we were not trying to do was simulate anything. We were not keeping track of how NPCs felt about you. We were not keeping track of every NPC's named. In fact, most NPCs in Reckoning don't have a name. And those NPCs that don't have a name, they can't go anywhere in particular. They can't do anything special. It's also not a game where you can climb every mountain that you see. We had strict spaces where the players could go, areas where the players could not go at any particular time. It's also not a sandbox. You can't go and generate, 8,000 blocks of cheese because you want to see what that looks like. We don't allow that sort of thing. That's not the kind of experience we were getting for. And I mentioned before that the game was too big. This is a comment on Reddit from Ken Rolston, who was our design visionary. Ken, you may recognize, his name was on Oblivion and Morrowind before that. This is him. He did a Ask Me Anything on Reddit where he says, the main quest is way too long. That's a technical term and an absolute requirement for a huge open world RPG. So when your design visionary says the game has to be too long, it must be too big, well, you've got a problem on your hands because the game is too long and it's too big. I don't have time to talk about every single AI system today, so today we're going to talk about the way we had to schedule way too many NPCs, how we dealt with programmers and designers finishing a game that was far too big, and how to balance the combat on a game that just lasted too long. Not that, this was a problem. That's what we were going for, but how does that affect your AI if you're going to do those things? So let's deal with scheduling first. What were our requirements for the scheduling system? Well, the first thing that we needed to do was have NPCs act by themselves. They had to be able to change where they were in the world, what activities and behaviors they can perform at any given time, and then variables on the behavior tree, such as where they could patrol or how fast they could walk. Every schedule line had to have their own conditional line, so you needed to be able to change your schedule line based on what quest stage the player was at or what time of day it was. And important NPCs needed to be able to do this no matter where the player was. So even if that object was not loaded, they needed to be able to walk into a space or perform a quest action. And because we were developing an engine while we were making the game, designers had to be able to do this all by themselves without any programmer input to debug a schedule or create it. Here's a picture of the tool that we came up with. This is our schedule editor. We're looking at the schedule for Alan Shear, who, if you've played the game, you know is an important quest NPC. This is only part of her schedule. Her schedule is actually about 45 lines long. Up top are the actual schedule lines. Each one has a name, what time of day it might happen, where in the world this character wants to be when they're running that schedule line. At the lower left is every activity in the game. When I say activity, I mean anything that an NPC could do, like play chess or lean up against a wall or start cooking something. So designers could restrict which ones a character could do at that particular schedule line. On the right, bottom right is where we have the behavior tree stuff. So not only what behavior tree you're running, but any variables we wanted to expose there, such as the walk speed, for example. And that orange box in the middle is the conditional expression editor. So this is what designers would use to create the conditions for this schedule line when it would run. And this is basically just a fancy wrapper on top of Lua. Like the conditions that you see there would all get written out to a Lua script. But having an editor here, which was a little bit cumbersome for designers to use, but they got used to it, it let us restrict the type of Lua that they could use for schedule lines, which meant later we could codify all of these things and not have to parse any Lua at runtime for all of the different schedule lines that we were using. So now that we've got schedules defined, we can do two different types of processing on those schedules. Objects that were actually loaded at the game, for the space that the player was in or directly connected spaces, had to be able to process their schedules, obviously, because the player could see them doing it. At the top level and largest spaces, we had a little over 400 of these loaded at a time. Global object references were what we called any named character that the simulation, that the game could reference at any time, whether the object was loaded or not. It knew where it was in the game, it knew what was going on with that object, and anybody could ask what that object was doing at that period of time. There are about 8,000 of those. So if the object's loaded, Okay, that's pretty simple, right? It's straightforward. You process their schedules anytime that you process their behavior. Anytime that they would go to do something, they check to see if they're running the right behavior tree first. But there's 400 of them, so you can't do it every single frame. And to handle this and also the behavior processing, we had a behavior level of detail system. You factor in several things. So here's a scene from the game, and I'm going to use this to illustrate the level of detail system. The first thing is that objects closer to the player get a higher priority. So this guy who's cowering a little bit further away from the other creatures close to the player does not get a update as frequently as some of the other things. Also, anybody back in the town beyond the bridge, I'm not picturing here, obviously has a lower priority as well. Any object that's in combat right now gets an automatic boost to their priority because what they're doing is probably important. And since it's an action game and we want combat to be responsive, anybody who's in combat is obviously doing something important. The behavior that ran last time a creature updates also can provide a hint to the level of detail system about how important it is. So these chickens are probably doing an idle behavior or a wander behavior. And that behavior can tell the level of detail system, I'm not doing anything particularly important. So if you don't check with me again for 5 seconds, it's probably not going to make a big difference. Finally, we do factor in how long it's been since the last time your behavior updated. So even the characters off in the town there get to run every so often so that nobody starves. All right, so then we have GORs to deal with, global object references. First thing to note is that you don't need to worry about any GOR that's a loaded object. If the GOR is loaded in the space, it's going to get handled by the local object processing that I just talked about. So we only really need to worry about GORs that are not loaded right now. And obviously, the first thing that you do is go through every GOR when you load it, when the game starts, and find that of 8,000 GORs, only 1,500 or so have a schedule that we need to worry about. So you cut out a big chunk right there. Our first attempt at how to process these GOR schedules is to build a map of every loaded space. So for example, if the player's in Dalentarth here, we might include Dalentarth, and then every space connected to Dalentarth, like the inn or the healer's hut. Odorath is the next big space over, so we'll include that as well. And then you build a map for each of those spaces to every GOR that has a schedule line that could move them into that space. If that sounds confusing, that's because it was. It reduced the number of GORs that we had to process, but it was a terrible amount of overhead. We spent more time building and maintaining the map than we did on actually processing the schedules. So when we figured that out, we were like, well, that was dumb. I know what we'll do. We'll just build a huge list, and we'll just blast through it. And that was way faster. We could process the entire list. We time sliced it because we were like, this isn't that important. Got through the whole list in about 3 seconds. And that's with on-purpose time slicing it, and that worked way better. If there's a lesson here, it's take advantage of your hardware, which likes to do the same thing over and over and over again. The only exception to that is that very important quest characters might need to update right this frame because of a narrative reason. They need to do something important for the player to see, and it would look dumb if it took up to 3 seconds for them to do that. So there are about 30 objects in the game that can process their schedule on every single frame. Okay, designer and programmer interface. As mentioned before, we had way too much to do and not enough time to do it, so you couldn't have a lot of programmer time based in writing behaviors and creating behaviors. There are a lot of behaviors in the game. We wrote 300 over the course of development, shipped about 100 or so on the disk. I wrote 7 originally. Now, programmers were involved in debugging these things or maybe taking a look at it, helping out a designer with stuff that needed to be done. But this is a lot of time back when you're developing an engine. There's no real secret sauce here other than having technically minded designers who are willing to learn a scripting language and throw themselves into it and make it their job. If your company can do that, it's great, and I would highly recommend it. You do need to support this every sprint. You don't get all of your programming time back. You need to do some things to help your designers learn the scripting language, or for us, we knew that particularly complicated things still needed to be done in the C++ engine. For us, complicated meant either anything having to do trigonometry, anything having to do with geometry or world positioning, anything with floating point math, we actually, built our own version of Lua that only had integers because we knew we never wanted to do floating point math in script. Okay, this is the slide where I admit all of the things that I probably should have thought of and seem obvious in retrospect. Designers are crazy, and they will do everything. I mean that. You will write a function, as I did, called attach object to rig node alias boss only because you're like, this is such a hack. I know you need it for this boss creature, but never use it anywhere else because that's all the time that I'm going to spend on it. And then they're going to use it on player abilities, and then they'll ask you why it doesn't work for player abilities, and you'll end up having to support it for player abilities anyway. Sigh. This next one is filed under things you do not want your lead programmer to walk into your office and say to you. The answer to that question is because your designer thought it was a great idea, not knowing any better, not really his fault, to have wander behavior create and destroy a game object every single time it runs. And then, when you finally populate the world with all of the chickens that are going to be in the world, then you get spikes like this, and that's bad. All right, so how do you fix this? You need to formalize a process. This is a slide from Damian's talk last year at the AI Summit, because last year at the AI Summit, there was a lot of discussion about this, and how do you properly use your designers who can script? How do you figure that out and make it work for you? And I kind of wish I'd heard it a year or two earlier than just last year. We're talking about doing something like this, where an engineer writes all of the baseline stuff, and then a designer can create it, but the engineer gets to look at it again. We might do something like this for the next project. We might do just formal script reviews, where every script has to go through a programmer before it gets approved and checked in. It's too important to ignore, and I don't have a clear answer on what we're going to do next, other than we're doing something because you just can't let it go. Difficulty, man, this one's great. I really, really, really like this subject, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit more than I probably should. Here's a picture of our forums 3 days after the game launched, and I did a search for difficulty because I want to see how our players are reacting to how hard the game is. And here's every thread on the first page of that search that says the game is too easy. Is that bad necessarily? Because every single one of those threads has a post in it that says, I think the difficulty's fine. So who do you believe? Do you believe Yahtzee, who did a zero punctuation review of the game, and he said that Reckoning was as challenging as using a sewing machine with a dwarf slave working the pedals? All right, so that's an open question. It's a design question, right? But how hard should your game be? And how do you balance a game for difficulty that could be 30 hours long if you're just doing the main quest, or 200 hours long if you're doing everything you can find? It's not a simple answer. For Reckoning in particular, in our play tests, when we asked people how difficult they thought the game was, it scored about a 4 on a 1 to 10 scale. And our lead designer, when I asked him, gosh, is that hard enough? He said, yeah, it's about hard enough. And he was vindicated. As it turns out, about 2/3 of our players play on the easiest difficulty setting. So I'm not going to say to you that you need to make your game easier or that you need to make it harder, but you need to think about who's going to play your game and what they're going to expect from it. It's also a role-playing game, so you need to think about character progression. One of the great things about role-playing games is feeling stronger than you were 5 hours ago or 10 hours ago. How do you do that? Is grinding a dirty word? Not necessarily. We're also making an open world game. So if people want to grind and not do any quest, you kind of have to support that. If you've got an open world game, people are going to do things that you didn't think of. In fact, they're going to do everything that you didn't think of. This is a picture of a statistics screen from a QA tester. I've circled up top 27 enemies killed, and you're thinking, that's not so bad. I killed 27 enemies in the first hour of the game. Except this is a screenshot taken after he'd beaten the game. He did a pacifist run, only killed the characters that he needed to kill to get through the main quest. He finished at level 21, which is about halfway to the level cap. Knowing what he was doing, he built his character for huge damage resistance, huge health regen, and he beat the last boss in 15 seconds. He also claims that the 2 chickens were killed by wolves, not by him. Here's another thing that our QA department found. Our final boss has HP, and it depends on difficulty level, so I can't tell you exactly how much HP the last boss has, but it's on the order of tens of thousands of hit points. But a QA tester found that if you were dedicated enough and you knew what you were doing and you maxed out your blacksmithing skill, you could create armor that stacked buffs just right so that you could do up to 5 million damage in one hit. As an extra special bonus, the very first review of Reckoning dinged us because they said that blacksmithing was useless. Okay, now this isn't really AI per se, but it will affect how your AI is perceived. So I encourage you to at least have this discussion with your designers about what their vision for the game is and what they think is going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about the individual battle AI, which is hopefully something that you might actually be able to use and take away from this. Our goal for the moment-to-moment combat here is to kind of get away from the Kung Fu Circle. If you haven't heard of this before, the Kung Fu Circle is the very Bruce Lee idea where the enemies surround your main character and one attacks at a time, and they each take turns, and it's all very cinematic. And that's okay. I think we can do better than that, because if only one character is attacking your player at a time, then your area of effect spells start to become not as useful. If too many are attacking at once, then the game is too hard and they can't get an attack in edgewise. So I think we can do better than that, and here's what we try to do. We also try to design a system where we could scale the system itself to your different difficulty levels. If we had a back-of-the-box trademarked AI system, this would be it. It's not on the back of the box because it's a little bit silly. The reason that this system ended up being known as Belgian AI is that my original sketches were frequently misinterpreted as waffles. The idea is that the player, and really every NPC, but we're going to look at it from the player's perspective here, carries a grid with different space, 8 spaces around him that enemies can claim to attack. This gets into difficulty level because the grid also has 2 variables on it, the grid weight and the attack weight. Let's say a boggart comes along and every enemy has a grid cost associated with it. So the boggart is a small enemy. We might say for balance purposes that it has a cost of 4, and it'll ask, hey, can I attack the player right now? Well, sure, because 4 is way less than the attack weight of 12, so we're going to give you a spot on the grid. You can approach and attack the player whenever you feel like it. We'll subtract that off, and along comes a troll. And a troll is a little bit bigger, so it's got a higher cost to be on the grid. But it's still less than the current attack weight, so it can come along too. And now you see where this is going, because the third boggart comes along. It has a grid cost of 4, but the grid weight is only 2. So the boggart, at most, can just hang out on the outskirts of the battle. Now, the boggart can choose something to do. May pick a different target to attack, may, have some kind of support behavior it can do or something like that. Or it may just wait for, to be in a different position, because we're evaluating this grid every frame. So if it ends up being in a good position to attack the player, it might be able to steal an attack slot from somebody else. What about attack weight? Well, in much of the same way, let's say that the troll has 2 different attacks that it could do. It's got a charge attack, which is a little bit powerful. It does more damage, or a sweep attack that's not as strong. And they each have a cost associated with them. So it can pick one so long as it's under the cost, and then we'll say if we pick the charge attack that does 6, we subtract that off. And now when the boggart gets to choose, he might have a stronger attack and a weaker attack too, but he can't pick his stronger attack because it is above the cost of the current attack weight. So he has to pick the lower cost attack. So just to be clear, we do also have cooldowns. There's a cooldown system separate from this. So we may be able to say, if the designer wants to, oh, there's only one troll charge attack that ever happens in the game at one time. But apart from the cooldown system, having this, this grid weight system affects how many enemies can be attacking the player at once and what kind of attacks they can use all at the same time. And now we've got something where you say, oh, if you put the difficulty level up to hard, these numbers just scale up. And now you have to deal with more enemies attacking at once and more difficult attacks to dodge or more damage-dealing attacks all at the same time. Okay, I'm going to play a video here of the grid weight of the grid in practice. So I've tuned it here so that only one person can attack at a time. You can see how everyone's got their spot in the grid and how as people come in and out of the attack, the grid weight, the number of people attacking adjusts. People can steal spots. People also use this to figure out where to stand in battle. I'm going to play this again. So the interior space, the lighter colored circle, is kind of like only people who have that permission to attack can go in there. And right now, as I said, I've only tuned it so that the attack weight is really low. Only one person can actually launch an attack. You can see other characters can't approach. They have that gray circle where they can wait for permission to come and attack. And as the player runs around, they might be granted permission unexpectedly or not. Okay, if you're taking away anything from this, if you're working on a really huge game, simplify, know your target platforms and what the hardware can do. Let your designer script if they're willing to, but make sure that you keep an eye on them. And the better that you can design a flexible system for difficulty, the better it will pay off later. Okay, that's it. It's over. More Reckoning tomorrow, right here in this room at 11:15. Thank you for your attention. We will take questions for any one of us at mics in the aisles, please. Wow, I must have done a really great job.
Yeah, no questions. Yeah.
Oh.
Damn it.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question about Reckoning. One thing I noticed about especially the end game of Reckoning was that many of the enemies' attacks interrupted the attack animation of the player character, and you could spend like 15 seconds not being able to do anything as a character because when you were in a kind of stunned from an attack, then other characters would still attack you. And I'm wondering if you saw that as an issue in a postmortem.
No, I mean, that's a function of who can attack you at once, which is dependent on difficulty level, and what attacks can stun or not were carefully picked by the combat team. So, as you say, that is towards the end of the game, so you know how the combat system works by then. We are punishing you a little bit more because it's the end of the game. It's supposed to be a little bit harder.
I see, but it may be seen as kind of frustrating when you actually can't move for like 10 or 15 seconds. You know, that's something different as I see it, different as difficulty itself. But,
Yeah, I don't, if for your player perception, if the player ever thinks that the game is frustrating, they're not wrong. So I can't disagree with you on that. But we're looking at how Stunlock affected the game's difficulty in particular, and talking about that for next time.
Thank
you. Let's take one over here.
Hi, thanks. Great talk. Just a quick question, actually, for the three of you. What technology platforms do you use to build your internal tools for like AI development and configuration? Is it C++, Java, .NET?
Big Huge Game. The question was what development platforms for tools in particular. Most tools at Big Huge Games are written in C# on .NET. We have one world-building tool that's still C++, but that's only because we had it written at the beginning of the project in C++.
Our tools are integrated right into the game, so we use C++ directly for all our AI work, all our level editing, all our script. Well, our scripting is done in Lua, but otherwise it's...
Yeah, I mean, with Skulls, it's all C#. The game logic and AI is pretty much, in the game. You can, like, tweak it there, but there's no external tools. We do have other tools, but not, in C# and Windows Forms, but not for the AI, because I'm working on it, and I'm a coder, and I like C#.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
I've got a question regarding the Darkness 2. You mentioned the velocity obstacles. My question is, how often were you evaluating those velocity obstacles, and what kind of overhead did that add to your AI system?
We actually did that pretty much every frame for every moving agent, which sounds like a lot, but The overhead wasn't terribly high at all. We could definitely on PC we could get over 20 agents moving around, like all interacting with each other without stressing anything. On console, it's obviously a lot less.
Okay.
This is a question for the three of you. What was the relative size of your AI teams? And by that I mean, how many programmers did you have on the project, and how many of them were AI programmers?
Okay, question is how many people were doing AI? On Reckoning, roughly 2. Myself and Sean Harris, I did all of the behavior side stuff. Sean did all of the locomotion padding stuff, plus one designer who wrote pretty much all of the behaviors.
How does that compare to the rest of your team? Like, how many programmers did you have?
We have roughly 12 programmers, thereabouts.
And then with Skulls, I mean, we're an XBLA game, so it's a fair bit smaller than Reckoning. Most things are smaller than so we had 2 programmers for the bulk of the project, and then our producer sort of helping out with programming towards the end, and I was the only one working on AI, and even that was only like part-time, essentially, because I was doing a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, for us we had, I think, 3.5 programmers. One of those was more animation focused, and yeah, the rest of our programming team, I think we had about another, probably on the engine and the rest of the gameplay, another about 10 programmers.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we got time for about one more.
I got a question about Darkness. When you were talking about your buddy system, did you guys encounter anything with like the shield guy calling more and more guys? And, like, did you ever run into it where you could shoot the guy that's getting guarded, and then they would just keep queuing in and just getting shot?
Yeah, actually, the way it works is that the ad is open, and once it's filled up, so once we only know we want one other guy to help out with us, everyone will respond, but we only keep the best score. Everyone kind of responds with a score of how appropriate it would be for them to come and help out. That's mostly based on distance, but we could add other factors in there. And if, like, the agent, the guy that was running over, died along the way, the ad process would just kind of start over. So he would reopen the ad, and he'd call for more guys. And typically, though, there would be a couple of other behaviors that would kick in. The shield guy was very aggressive, so he'd get right up into your face and shield bash you, knock you back. And that also broke up that pattern so that there was some time for you to kind of get knocked back, and then someone else would come and form up with him.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.